Whispers and Storms, an original post-apocalyptic story from the Spinosaurus. This story is a follow-up to The Bridge. Be sure to listen to it first. You can find it and other narrations from this post-apocalyptic continuity linked below. So, why is it that you like to tease me so much? Mabel asked. Or is there not a reason at all? I think poke fun at is the better term, Spino replied. But yes, there is a reason. Like I've explained before, isn't that what big brothers are supposed to do? Only if they have the maturity of a toddler, Mabel said, shaking her head at Spino's response. It had been a week since repairs on the bridge had come to an end. Security had been increased after the Allosaurus attack, but no further crises had occurred during the reconstruction. Repairs had been successful, much to everyone's delight, and things had returned to normalcy. All the while, Mabel and Spino had continued their normal routine of spending their days together in the forest surrounding the community. But I'm the big, vicious dinosaur, Spino replied in a low, sinister growl. One with big claws and jagged teeth, he added exaggeratedly. You're a big softy is what you are, Mabel giggled, not fooled by the show at all. And you have the maturity of a toddler. Oh, is that what you think? Spino asked. Yep, Mabel giggled, hugging his nose. But that's okay. I love you anyway, my big, vicious dinosaur brother. Oh, you only love me when you want to make sure that the big, scary dinosaur doesn't eat you all up, he said in an even deeper voice. Spino! Oh, fine, I'll stop poking fun at you. Just for you, Spino said, finally dropping the act and nuzzling Mabel again. Mabel laughed and continued hugging Spino tightly. By the way, dinosaur or not, it is really rude to constantly tease your only sister. Maybe from a human perspective, you guys have way too many social norms and boundaries. It's weird and too complicated for me, Spino replied, licking his teeth. As a dinosaur, I see things much more simply. You filter almost everything you say. I don't feel the need to do that. I simply say what comes to my mind. Life is much easier that way. He looked down at Mabel as he spoke and smiled. She was such a wonderful light in his life, and she had the ability to brighten up the world around her. But she wasn't the only incredible thing to come along in recent years. The community had changed over the decade following the end of the war with the Dino Riders. In fact, all 4 communities had changed. Spino was always happy to offer a helping claw when needed, dragging down trees to a wagon or herding schooling fish towards the fishing nets in the water. He was the only talking dinosaur anyone in the communities had seen, and the only other talking prehistoric reincarnations Spino had ever seen were the Titanoboa and the Rex, although he had only seen one of them speak. Non-talking dinosaurs were also useful. Spino found it amusing when the community started using certain species like horses, cows, or other domesticated animals. Triceratops and Gallimimus were 2 species that proved to be the easiest to domesticate. Domesticating animals was far from the only thing that changed. The walls surrounding the community had been reinforced on several occasions, so it was now much more defensive than its original version. The walls had been expanded, built taller, and fortified to be heavier. Trenches were dug along the outside of the walls, and tunnels were built so they could be accessed from inside the community. There was a series of doors built into the ground like cellar doors that allowed guards to enter the trenches and defend the community from both the ground and the walls in case of an attack. Nick knew that an attack from another group was inevitable and wanted to be ready when it came. There had to be other groups out there somewhere, because it was a big world, and many other people had survived the apocalypse. Just as the crumbling buildings offered a glance into an old world, the common nonverbal dinosaurs and prehistoric fauna offered a similar glimpse into the distant past of millions of years before. And, since all prehistoric life forms had returned, from the powerful Basilosaurus The iconic woolly mammoth to the monstrous Giganotosaurus, anyone was able to get a glimpse into what life was like throughout all of time. It made Spino wonder about what life back then was really like, though he'd never know for sure. Just like no one would ever truly know what caused their new world to come about. Whatever the anomaly had been and how it had happened, it didn't matter. It had happened, and those left had to survive in the world it had brought on. Spino looked down when Mabel pulled herself free from his grasp and stretched. "Do you smell that?" she asked. Spino looked up and sniffed the air, and did indeed notice something he hadn't noticed before. While musing about what the world was like during the time of the dinosaurs, he hadn't noticed a new smell in the air. As he sniffed the air again, Mabel sat down at the dinosaur's side and waited to see if he had caught on as well. And he did. He looked down at her and nodded. Rain. "We should probably head back home, right?" Mabel questioned. The sound of distant thunder made Spino nod and stand up. Yep. Nick walked out of his house and sighed. Even with the bridge repairs successfully finished, he was not relaxed. Being the leader was not all sunshine and rainbows. It was stressful and always tiring. It was something you had to learn to cope with and not let consume your life. That was the hard part. Aside from being someone everyone looked to for guidance, he had many other duties around the community, many of which he'd volunteered for. One such duty was being the one to hold a brief worship service on what the community had decided to be the new Sunday for those in the community who were religious. He also took to educating himself over various religions and spiritual cultures, so he could better serve those in the community who were from various faiths, because he'd learned quickly Christianity wasn't the only religion present within the walls. He often took a voluntary shift on the wall with the guards as well, and, with the many other chores that made up his day, he was busy all the time. The one thing that was so nice about Mabel no longer being a toddler was that she no longer needed him or Susan to watch her all day every day. In fact, she had become rather independent for her age and spent her days with Spino, who was more than happy to play the role of babysitter. Spino always made sure she came home perfectly fine. Spino was like her giant, prehistoric guardian angel. Like he'd been for Nick when the apocalypse was first setting in. However, being the parent of a single independent child was going to change soon. Susan wanted another kid, and she had been persistent about the matter. Nick wasn't so sure he could deal with anything else on his plate right then, but he had given in, and now Susan was due in 8 months. They hadn't announced it yet, not even to Mabel or Spino. The only person who knew about the pregnancy, besides the community's doctor, was Steve, and he was keeping quiet about it. When Nick felt overwhelmed and that he needed to think, he went to the one spot he could always clear his head. Mark's cabin. Nick had built the cabin for Mark just as he had promised he would do before his death. Once the community repairs were underway, Nick stepped aside and built the entire cabin alone. The cabin was something simple but nice. It had one room with a dirt floor, a straw bed, and an earthy, comforting smell. It even had windows, made possible after some scouts for the community found a window store that hadn't been touched by looters. Whenever Nick arrived at the cabin, he'd step inside, close the door, and sit on the straw bed. As he looked around, he admired what he accomplished for his friend. It was exactly as Mark described it, and Nick knew that Mark would have loved it. In the early days, he'd gotten to know Mark better than anyone in the community. And when Mark was shot, it was hard on Nick, and building Mark's dream cabin was a good distraction. Aside from fulfilling Mark's wish, it helped Nick make peace with the loss of his friend. On the handmade table was an unopened pack of cards. Nick chuckled softly when he saw it, as he remembered how excited Mark was when he suggested playing card games to pass the long evening hours. Nick sighed as he thought of the card games that had never been played in the cabin, of the promised hours of fun that had never been shared. The rumble of thunder shook Nick out of his thoughts, and he went to the window and slid the partially opened curtain aside. The blue sky was rapidly filling with dark clouds. He opened the door, stepped outside of the cabin, and looked up at the sky. Another summer storm was moving in. They seemed to be occurring more often than usual at this time of year. Mabel, get home, he thought. She didn't get home. She and Spino were still walking back to the community when the heavy, stinging rain suddenly descended on them. Along with the downpour, the storm brought powerful gusts of howling wind with it. The rain didn't really bother Spino. He had slept in worse weather. But Mabel was a different matter. She couldn't stay in the downpour long. After a quick search for an abandoned building of any kind that could offer shelter, Spino found nothing. He decided they would stop and wait for the storm to blow over. He crouched down onto all fours, angled his body so it blocked most of the wind and water, and said to Mabel, "We're going to stay here. I don't fancy keeping you out in this weather." "What?" Mabel shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind and rain. "I don't want to stay out in the rain." Spino sighed as he heard the misery in his sister's voice, and got an idea. Not one he liked, but one he felt would work. He faced Mabel, got close to her, and then looked her right in the eyes. "Yeah, I know." He nudged her gently, his face sympathetic, and after a moment he became very serious. "I can get you out of the rain. Do you trust me?" Caught off guard by his tone, Mabel nodded. "Yeah?" she said. Spino nodded. "Okay. Climb in, then," he replied, and opened his jaws next to her. Mabel visibly tensed. Joking around or playing was one thing, but this was another altogether. This would be practically laying herself out on the dinner plate. After wiping her wet hair out of her eyes and looking Spino in his eyes again, Mabel slowly climbed over his teeth and sat down inside the dinosaur's narrow but large mouth. Mabel shuddered as Spino gently closed his jaws, doing it slowly as if allowing her a final chance to change her mind, forcing her to lie down on her back as they came together. Spino then laid down too, curling himself up to wait out the weather, all the while protecting Mabel the best way he could, given the situation. The sight itself was not too dissimilar to how a mother crocodile carried her hatchlings, and in the old world, it might even have lent credence to a theory proposed by some that Spinosaurus did the same with their own hatchlings. "Sorry. Hopefully it lets up soon," Spino managed to say while keeping his jaws tightly clenched. He felt Mabel roll a tiny bit and touch one of his teeth. "Yeah, hopefully," she said, closing her eyes and trying not to think about being inside the jaws of a Spinosaurus. At least she knew Spino would never actually eat her, and at least he knew better than to make a joke about it at that moment. With her eyes closed, she was able to pretend she was snug in a sleeping bag, a very wet sleeping bag. The size comparison wasn't terribly far off either. Even though Spino was oversized for his species, his jaws were still narrow, small enough to trigger anyone's claustrophobia, in fact. Having seen the massive jaws of a dinosaur close around her had been terrifying on a primal level. But she pushed away the nervousness because it was Spino, her best friend, and her loving and caring dinosaur brother, her fierce protector who always kept her safe, just as he was doing now. Mabel eventually decided that she'd rather sleep to make time go faster, so she kept her eyes closed and tried to snuggle in as best she could. She said, "I think I'm gonna try and sleep, Spino. And thanks. This is better than the rain." Spino smiled ever so slightly. Sleep well, he thought, closing his eyes too, but not sleeping. He hoped the rain would pass soon, and he could relieve Mabel of her less than desirable accommodations. The trust that she'd placed in him pleased him. "I promised that I would never do anything to hurt you. Ever," he silently swore, a reaffirmation of a promise he had made so many times since he'd first laid eyes on his sister. Nick looked out of his living room window. The storm raged all that day without stopping. Night had fallen, and still there were no signs of the storm relenting, or of his daughter coming home. Well, we might be fixing that bridge again, he thought. He sighed and continued to look outside. Nothing was going to distract him right now, not with Mabel missing. The storm was a bad one. In the old world, he would probably be hearing tornado sirens. Nick knew Spino would do whatever it took to keep Mabel safe, but he was still worried. Susan walked over to him, obviously worried as well, and Nick softly said, "She'll be fine. Spino won't let anything happen to her." Nick tried to reassure her, hugging her close. Susan didn't speak. She just leaned against him and looked outside, hoping for a sign that their daughter was coming home. "Are you sure?" Susan eventually asked. Nick nodded. "Yes. He always protected me when it was just me and him. He'd die for her if that was what it took to keep her safe. We have to trust that he's got her somewhere safe to wait out the weather." When Mabel woke up, she found herself lying against the side of one of Spino's hands, in a manner that his finger was propped up under her head, somewhat like a pillow. The storm was over, and the morning sun was high in the sky. She realized quickly that they'd been outside all night and sat up. "Good morning," Spino greeted her when he saw that she was awake. How'd you sleep?" he asked after a moment. Mabel shrugged. I guess it wasn't too bad. Just a bit constrictive. Hopefully it doesn't happen again, though." Spino chuckled and nudged her with his nose, thankful that she seemed no worse for wear. It seemed that she'd slept far more soundly than he had. "Thank you for trusting me," Spino said. Mabel smiled at him and simply nodded. "All right, come on," Spino continued, standing up. "Let's get you home. You've got to be hungry." "And thirsty," Mabel said as Spino sat her on his neck. "And in need of a change of clothes. You smell like fish," Spino added. "Hey, you're the one who eats it, not me." The trip back went quickly enough, and Mabel was eager to get back and get into some clothes that weren't soaked through with dinosaur saliva. The trip home went without incident, and when they arrived, they met a search party that was just about to leave to look for them. Nick was leading the party, and when he saw his daughter, relief spread across his face. Spino set Mabel on the ground, and she ran to her father, who pulled her into a tight hug. "You're safe," Nick whispered, kissing Mabel on the side of the head. "They were so worried." "I'm okay, Daddy. Spino kept me safe last night," Mabel replied, hugging her father tightly as well. "Your clothes are sticky," Nick mused as they continued hugging. Mabel giggled. "I don't know why," she said, giving Spino a small smile and wink. Spino rolled his eyes as best a dinosaur could in response. Nick noticed the silent interaction and stood up. "You run along. Your mother is worried sick," he then thought to himself. "She doesn't need the extra stress." Out loud, though, he turned to the people in the search party and said, "Okay, I guess we don't have to run all over the forest looking for them now. You can go back to what you were doing. Thank you." Light laughter followed the quip, and everyone turned and walked back through the gate. Some went to start their guard shifts, others headed to return weapons to the community armory. As everyone headed back inside, Mabel among them, Nick looked up at Spino. "Thank you," he said. Spino smiled. "You knew I wouldn't let anything happen to her." "I know, buddy. I know. Thank you. Truly." Two scouts from the community were running through the forest, and they were running fast. They were miles out, trying to find signs of other groups and communities. There had been recent rumors of there being other communities to the south, after some wayward radio transmissions had been intercepted. New ones and new people to add to the map. Now the two who were sent out to see what they could find were running, panic-stricken, through the deep forest, being stalked by something they didn't understand. "Here! One of the scouts yelled, and they ducked past some trees and down into a ditch with steep, muddy banks on each side. They pressed themselves against the muddy slopes and prayed. Groaning, one pulled a dart out of his leg, and he suddenly began to feel sick. They hadn't seen who or what was even after them, and the voices they could hear seemed to come from nowhere. "Where'd they get to?" came a voice from up in the trees. It seemed disembodied, like a ghost speaking, because there was no movement or sign of a person speaking anywhere. The forest was completely still. "I don't know. It doesn't matter. We'll find them, their group, and kill them all," the second said. The two scouts pressed themselves tighter against the muddy bank and kept praying. To be continued. All right, with that, we have reached the end of what will probably be the last narration featuring the characters Spino and Nick. As of the ending of this narration, the main characters have all been introduced, as have the major plot points for the first act, and so has the first big plot point as well. Ominous voices coming from seemingly nowhere seem to indicate that something has found our group and is coming for them. What that something is, and how these plot points play out, and what happens next, will all be revealed when the Spinosaurus, my original novel, is published. If you are curious about seeing more of this universe, then check out the other narrations in the playlist linked below. I'm also not done doing these audio narrations, as I've also got one more in the works. Part 3, To a Survivor's Daily Routine, which will wrap up in about the same boat as this one, with that audio trilogy having introduced all the respective stories, plotlines, characters, and concepts for its own respective story. If you have listened to these and are curious to see more, then please either subscribe and stick around for news about publication dates for these, or check back in every few months for updates. All videos about this topic will go in the same playlist, the one with the narrations. You can find it linked below. There is also a concept art video showing off illustrations based on a few scenes and also some character designs, so check that out as well if you're interested. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you in the next video.